The great performers are not people that never lose. The great performers are people that lose well. The happiest people are people that never hurt. The happiest people are people that hurt well. And if we can't deal with the coexistence of having ideals and perfectionistic good goals and we want to kill it, if we can't deal with the reality that sometimes we don't kill it, and how do I process that, learn from it, get over it, flush it out, and move on, then I'm not going to be able to perform well.
Welcome to the Beyond High Performance podcast, featuring content and conversations from me, Jason Jaggard, along with our elite coaches at Novus Global, their high-performing clients, and the faculty of the METAPERFORMANCE Institute for Coaching. On this podcast, you'll hear some of the world's best executive coaches and high-performing leaders, artists, and athletes discuss how they continue to go beyond high performance in their lives and businesses. Welcome to a special holiday episode of the METAPERFORMANCE Show. I sat down again with Dr. Henry Cloud, a renowned psychologist, best-selling author, and leadership expert whose groundbreaking work has helped individuals and organizations unlock their full potential. Known for his ability to blend deep psychological insights with practical tools for growth, Dr. Cloud's expertise has guided leaders across industries, from Fortune 500 companies to professional athletes as well as faith-based communities. Our conversation today dives into themes from his latest book, Why I Believe, a psychologist's thoughts on suffering, miracles, science, and faith. Many times we don't think of faith when we think of leadership and human performance, but for Dr. Cloud, that's at the core of his success in helping people transform their lives for decades. We explore the profound intersection of faith and human flourishing, unpacking how ancient wisdom informs modern approaches to leadership, relationships, and well-being. Dr. Cloud shares 4 pillars of modern psychology, revealing the critical role faith plays in how we relate to ourselves, each other, and going beyond high performance. He also gives me a hard time about my hard time with miracles. And, Henry has become a friend for me and in many ways a mentor, and I hope you enjoy this special episode of our show. Before we dive into this episode, a quick note. This interview involves Henry and I talking about our personal spiritual journeys that involve the Christian faith generally and the person of Jesus specifically in our lives and leadership. It's a great episode. I'm really excited for you to hear it. But it's also worth mentioning that while my personal beliefs may resonate with many at our firm, they don't necessarily represent the views of everyone at Novus Global, our clients, or our audience, of course. And with that in mind, I just wanted to give you a friendly heads up about the topic of the episode before jumping in. So we have Dr. Henry Cloud. Henry, thanks for being on our show.
It is great to be here.
And Henry, it's always good to have you on the show. We actually, almost exactly a year ago, we released another episode, which we'll put in the show notes, where we talked about your book, Trust. And you have a new book out, and it's different than all your other books in many ways. And we're going to get into it in a minute. But first, I want to reintroduce you to our audience. And so, of course, we said this in the intro, but nearly 20 million copies of books sold. That is no joke. And also, I think I had on the last podcast, I said the wrong number. I want to make sure I get the right number this time. Over 45? Is it 45 books? Is that how many books you've written?
I really don't know.
Yeah.
Seriously, I do not know.
So
I know it's more than one because I think I'm tired.
That's right. So I think what your people sent me is accurate, and it's nearly 20 million copies sold, 45, around 40, we're going to say 45-ish books written. That's prolific, and the impact is huge. And so you're clinical psychologist by training, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But also, a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are professional athletes, and and sport was a part of your life when you were younger, and it was going to be a much bigger part of your life. So let's just dip our toes in there.
Well,
for
also,
a second.
I mean, probably more relevant to the listeners than my sad story is now, I work with high performers, in business mostly, but also, professional sports. So the thing about a human is humans are wired in a certain way. We're all basically, we all came out the same design, the same architect. We all look alike. I watched a heart surgery one time, and the surgeon, he opened the patient up. He said, "You know what I love about my work?" I said, "What?" And he said, "Every day, this is my office." He pointed to the heart inside the body. He said, "This is my office, and every day it looks the same." The consistency of humans. But the the point I was going to make is whether you are in business or a professional athlete or some other area of performance, the dynamics that drive performance are all the same. The context changes. And even in business, it may be with your investors, it may be in a boardroom, it may be with whomever, but you're still the equipment that's got to deliver, to whatever the demands of those realities are. And so that's what's exciting to me about this work, because humans are designed to perform. We're all designed to be fruitful, to get results. And there are ways that happens, and when it's not happening, there are things we can do about it. So
Yeah,
anyway,
I've even heard you say, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but there's the way you relate to yourself, there's the way you relate to others, and then there's like the way that you perform or create results or be fruitful. Is that a nice framework for how people? I've heard you mention that before, and I just wanted to see if you wanted to elaborate on that for our audience as we jump into different categories of human flourishing.
one of the frameworks I talk about sometimes, which, when you said perform, is I think it's really, really helpful to think of, what does our life consist of? What does a human's life consist of? And I think of it as a pie. So if you think of a pie, everybody's life has three big slices to it. And what we find is those slices are interrelated. One of the slices is what I call the clinical piece of life. And that's how you feel. Your energy levels, your thinking, your moods, your anxieties, your fears, your addictions, your depressions, you know, or on the other side, you're thriving, your happiness, and you got zest, and, you got optimism and all that kind of stuff. So we all have a clinical life. That's when you walk into the doctor's office, they say, "How are you doing?" Well, that's probably what they're asking about, not your portfolio.
Hmm.
The second piece of life is our relational life. We're all relational beings, and so we relate in various contexts. There's marriage or dating. You shouldn't do both of those, by the way. Pick one. But married or dating, if somebody's single, or extended family, work teams, cultures and works, business deals, boards, investors, friendships, all that. And so how our relational equipment is working ends up really, really affecting our lives. And then the third piece of the pie, as you mentioned, was performance. And we're all made to be fruitful, to get some results. We have we have dreams, but if those don't end up in the real world with real results, they're nothing more than fantasies. The difference to me between a dream and a vision is a vision actually ends up existing.
Hmm.
And and there are issues that we have that keep us from getting the results in business and in other areas, sport, you know, that have to do a lot of what goes on in here and down in here in our hearts. So that's kind of life. And then I think what you put with that was, um, we all have, if you look at all when did they start that stuff? Somebody got an idea to call it emotional intelligence back when, but for a century or more, psychology has talked about that we have intra-psychic, inside of ourselves, relational dynamics that go on, and we have interpersonal dynamics that go on, and those really affect each other. And so that's kind of the world I hang out in, with CEOs and their teams, and high performers.
That's right. And professional athletes, and we've talked off the record about who some of your clients are, and they are, you've heard of them. If you're listening to this, you know who they are. You've heard of them, and Henry honors his NDAs, and so there's that as well. So so Henry has been working with people who are at the top of their game in various professions for a really long time, and so now you have this new book that's come out, and book number 46 or whatever, and it's called, and it's a different kind of book, and if bear
Way
with me.
different.
Yeah, way
Way,
different.
way, way, way different.
And so I'm
Than
gonna
all my other books.
and I'm excited to talk about it. And frankly, it's something that Henry and I share some things in common in terms of some of our worldview, and it's not something that we talk much on the podcast about, but we're going to talk about it today. But I want to build a frame for it and a frame for the book. And so bear with me just as a second as I do this. So um, years ago, uh, I was working with a senior executive of the company was about a $300 million company at the time. And when I had been working with the company, and other coaches in our firm had been working in the company for a little bit. And so then when we got introduced to each other, the client and I, he said, "Hey, Jason, like I'm looking forward to working together." I said, I am too. I've heard a lot. I've gotten to know him and I liked him a lot. And he goes, "And here's the thing, like I know some parts about your background and like your previous jobs that you had and things like that, and a little bit of your worldview." And he's like, "I just want to let you know, I don't want any of that. I just want like let's just do the performance coaching stuff." And I really like this guy. So I said, okay. So we get into the performance coaching, and we're about 3 months into the coaching, and we realized that every time we tried to increase his performance or talk about him accomplishing more, doing more, those types of things, a lot of like shame and guilt and like low self esteem and things like that were coming up, and it actually made the work counterproductive. And finally, he was like, "Hey, Jason, like, what do I do with this shame and guilt stuff?" And then I say, "Well, there's a place we can go, but at the beginning of the coaching, you said you didn't want any of that." And he smiled. He knew exactly what I was talking, and I was smiling too. Like it's a very congenial conversation. And he smiled. And he's like, "Okay," I'm like we can go there now. And I said, "Great," because the reality was like I didn't know how to help other than by bringing this into this space. And so we started talking about his spirituality. We started talking about his, like, for lack of a better phrase, like faith. And he started in our coaching, he started taking some risks of putting himself in like faith environments as a mechanism of exploring giving and receiving love and grace and forgiveness and all these ancient ideas that are really helpful to increasing human performance. And what I really so Henry's written a new book called Why I Believe. And the the first part of the book is, I really enjoyed reading it, by the way. And the first part of the book is kind of a spiritual memoir around just how faith has intersected his life in really beautiful ways. Then the second part of the book, he tells like a series of um, really interesting stories that
I was wondering what adjective you were gonna come up with.
yeah, yes, stories
Now
that
what now I'm gonna interview you here for a second. What was your big, hiccup, struggle, like, you're trying to say these stories?
well, there are stories that I think I'm putting myself in the shoes of a listener who has maybe had negative experiences with faith, and or is it feels like it's kind of like a fairy tale, and or frivolous, and or maybe even dangerous, or some people look at it as like dangerous or toxic. And if they're reading some of these stories, they're hard to believe. Like they're hard to believe stories that are Henry's honest accounts of, like, for lack of a better phrase, the divine interacting and interceding in his life.
The subtitle of the book, it's called Why I Believe, and the subtitle is Suffering. No, a psychologist's thoughts on suffering, and that's the first part of the book, because the way I entered into the world of faith was through my own suffering and pain. Suffering, and then it says suffering, miracles, science, and faith. And so the section that you're talking about is, the where most of the miracles are kind of housed. And you
But
you
you're not
said
so
there.
sorry, you're not talking about miracles. When I saw that, I thought like you were talking about like miracles from history, like the Catholic Church, or like even miracles in sacred texts and things like that, which is not what you're talking about. You're talking about experiences you've had that cannot be explained, or you find difficult to explain any other way.
Things I have seen and experienced. Yeah. These are, I mean, the book's about why I believe. Well, I've seen miracles happen. So that's part of why I
Why
believe.
you
But
call it
but
that?
but what I was laughing about was you were saying, they're actually like hard to believe. Well, that's why they call them miracles.
I know why they call them miracles. Okay. So then the third part of the book is where I'd like to park for most of our conversation. And so if reading crazy stories about Henry's life with God interests you, please go pick up his book. That's part two.
My
All of the
my brother-in-law, whom I sent it to, who, is not really a person of faith. In fact, he's kind of sort of against it, and he read it and he goes, "D I don't think you should be telling people that you've seen, like, hey, you'll never work again.
yeah,
They're
and
gonna
that's what
think you're crazy."
that's what I mean. It's a brave book, and I want to honor that. And this is something that so I occasionally the Global Leadership Summit. By the way, so the Global Leadership Summit is one of the largest leadership conferences in the world, and Henry has spoken there more times than maybe anybody else. He's spoken there many times, and it's simulcast. It's live translated into dozens of languages. You're speaking to oftentimes hundreds of thousands of people, and, what am I so then that's how I met Henry was I do guest hosting on that podcast. I volunteer. It's something I love to do to support that organization and their mission to bring leadership to the world, and I really enjoy doing it. And Henry also does a lot of stuff volunteering, and he's always there whether he's speaking or not, just hanging out and serving people and learning as well. He has a notebook and modeling. This isn't why he does it, but for me, he's modeling humility and teachability and all these things. And, whenever I'm hosting the leadership podcast and you get to interview people who are of a faith background and that's a big part of their life and people who aren't and everything. And one of the things that I've never really been able to talk to anyone about overtly, even on that podcast yet, and that I'd love to talk with you about in this conversation is, um, in the firm, we talk a lot about, I'll say this phrase over and over again, and I'll say it about different things. I'll say, like, love is a performance enhancing drug, or like gratitude is a performance enhancing drug. Like, there's things in life that are free and readily available that will increase your performance in relationships and work and wherever, um, that have been enshrined in many ways for thousands of years in our shared sacred texts. And I'm going to use that language, which is just another word for the Bible. And there are some people listening to this where they have been taught that the Bible is to be thumped, or they've been taught that the Bible is like a weapon of some kind, or they've been taught that it's a answer machine, or they've been taught that it's a thing that people use to lord over them or to feel self-righteous to, right? Like, a lot of people have had a lot of negative experiences with something that for you and I is very precious to us and has been very life-giving. And
Well, yeah, you know, and since I've written the book, a lot of people are talking to me about this stuff, and um, what's fascinating to me is all those things you listed are true, but what's fascinating to me is in my environments of work where I hang out with and friends, I'll ask, well, which parts of the Bible did you struggle with, or what, and especially when I ask about the Gospels,
mm,
because when you're talking about the Christian faith, you really, I mean, it is the whole thing. The Bible is clear about that. The Old Testament points to the Messiah, but the New Testament's really about him. And what I'm hearing over and over is, no, I've never read them. That
yeah,
like that's the most common answer I get, that somebody has not read the Gospels.
yeah,
They they have an opinion of Jesus, or an opinion of Christianity, but they've never read it. And the sad thing to me, and I talk about this in the book, I've got one of my obstacles was to faith was, I always said, I I didn't have a problem with God. I just don't like his friends,
yeah, yeah,
which it was the religious weirdos and a lot of Christians that I ran into that really kind of, got in the way for me. And then I read what he said, and they were nothing like what he said.
yeah.
So
And
that was
that
an
was Gandhi's
interesting
experience
thing.
too. Like, Gandhi said that I like your Christ. It's your Christians that I don't like. And to your point, and by the way, I'm gonna play translator just a little bit, and maybe this is patronizing for some people, but I think it won't be for some of the people that I want to hear this podcast. So when Henry says the Gospels, what he's talking about is there are 4 like biographies, religious biographies of a Jewish rabbi that Jesus, and that's what Henry means when he says the Gospels. Each one of those, we call them the Gospels because it's I believe it's the Greek word. Gospel is Greek for good news. It was a word that was used really in ancient Rome. Whenever there was a new king was born in the Roman Empire, that it would be like a declaration, like a gospel. Hey, there's a new king that was born, and because people weren't allowed to not like the Roman Empire, they were all excited about it. So the, that's
It's
and
sort of like every 4 years, somebody gets excited or sad here.
That's right. That's right. And so, and we're probably going to drop this episode around Christmas of this year. And so, if you're listening to this, the world is celebrating a religious holiday, and yeah, there's Santa and all these things, but there's this kind of sense of a declaration of gospel. Like there's a new, with every new king, there was like a new authority. There was like a new way of living. There was like a new invitation to what that kingdom was going to be like. The Roman Empire was going to be like. And in this sense, with the story of Jesus coming into the world, being born, there was like a gospel declaration of a new way of relating, a new way of a new set of values, a new way of caring about each other, and a new way of contributing to the world that he ushered in through his teachings and things like that. So that's a little bit of the background there. Now, Henry, what I'd like to do, because I think the last part of your book is my favorite part. I like all of it, but you mention essentially, and I'll let you reframe this because
Sort of skipped over the wacky part there.
it's well, it's not wacky. It's uh it's not wacky, but the and by the way, maybe another time we can come on the podcast and you and I can do our own podcast show around miracles as a function of performance enhancement. Because one of the stories you tell, we'll do one story. I'd
Well,
like for you to.
I wouldn't be doing what I do today without several of those miracles,
That's right, and this is a weird
especially
way of
speaking to arenas.
that. You know what? That's actually wow. Well, I'm gonna leave that one alone. That's a good story. I like that story. The one that I found most incredulous in a good way was where you were I think you were on the phone with a woman, and or maybe you were working with her clinically. I'm going to get some of these details wrong. And then you were afraid for her life. You thought she was going to kill herself. The GPS story.
Yeah, I thought you were when talking about work and performance. I thought you were talking about I was about to sign a really big deal. That one and
Oh, that's a good one too.
the phoner.
Yeah. All right. So there's all these good stories. So maybe we'll leave them alone for another time. So but part of the worldview is saying that God does intervene in our lives, not always the way we want, but oftentimes in ways that redirect our lives or enhance our lives or guide our lives into things that are so beautiful and meaningful for us that we sometimes we didn't even know we wanted them, or things that we're afraid to say that we want, or dreams and hopes we have that we're afraid to even give ourselves permission to want. And I feel like part of your story, Henry, and also part of mine is believing in we're going to use the word God, like a personal force in the world that holds up the world, that holds up existence. I think some of the early 20th century neo-Orthodox theologians called it like a ground of being, and that ground of being knows you better than you know yourself, and is inviting, like I think it was Kierkegaard who said, with God's help, I shall become myself. And I found that to be true in my own life. And I think that you found that, I guess, let me ask you, have you found that to be true in yours as well? That God, in your dance with the divine, that God has helped you become a version of yourself that maybe even you wouldn't necessarily believe was possible.
No, I mean, no doubt about that. If you read the book, I started off, my faith journey started off when my whole life fell apart. And I actually had a life of I mean, I don't want it to sound weird, but a life of high performance.
Yeah.
And then, it fell apart and it hit bottom. And so, and then over the course of that journey, as you're saying, he knew things about me that I didn't know about what my deepest, truest passions and abilities were, and shaped me and molded me into being like Kierkegaard said. We're always in a journey of trying to become more of what we truly are, um, and less of what we're not. And that is, as the Strength Finders movement for sure. That's a good idea,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
That's right.
know. Tom Brady should probably not have been, a boxer. We ought to do what we're good at.
Yeah,
It's-
which is a profoundly ancient idea, and yeah, whether it's in like the spiritual activist Paul Tarsus talks about in 1 Corinthians 12, I think Romans 12. These are letters that were these ancient letters that are codified in our sacred text, talking about, hey, figure out what you're good at and lean into that, and that you've been uniquely gifted and designed to do things. So I keep circling the wagons, but I want to for the second half of the conversation here. I want to talk about the four things you mentioned. And I'm going to read. I'm going to read them, and then we're going to dive deep into each of them. Because frankly, we could have. I could talk to Henry for hours about just these four things, and these four things are in some ways like cornerstones of modern psychology, and also um, heavily influenced and mirror ancient wisdom uh, that has influenced both Henry and I's life. Is that fair to say?
well, I would say these 4 things were not even. You don't even have to put them in a faith context. I would say that, not only have they influenced both of our lives, these 4 things influence every life of anybody that's ever walked the planet. And that's not an opinion, that's evidence-based, empiricism. We know from research, and experience and clinical experience, and everybody that's listening will be able to identify that these 4 issues are really, really, really going to drive the majority of what goes on in your life.
That's right. So I'm gonna read them briefly. I have them directly taken from the book. This is section 4 or section 3 rather, and then we'll go through each one. And I would love for you to wax poetic, and we can talk about each of them. So the first one is, and if you're an eager beaver note taker, this is worth taking notes on. Henry's books are very generous around like lists and categories and framings and frames. Each of his books really offer a lot of handholds to wrap your mind around really big ideas. So the first one is the issue of attachment, which is bonding and connection versus human isolation, disruptive connection, or lack of connection. Then the next one is the issue of freedom, which is separateness, autonomy, boundaries, differentiation, and control. The third one is the conflict between the coexistence of good and bad. And this is the way that I relate to this when I was reading it, Henry, was like people dealing with the world as it is, like struggling with how imperfect the world is sometimes and how wonderful the world is sometimes. And the last one is the leveling of power that evolves from childhood and adulthood. So that really is like your relationship to power. And so these four things uh, are, at least the way Henry presents them, are like four things that affect everyone that are necessary for lack of a better phrase, psychological well-being. And that
And
are,
that you have to build equipment for.
that's right. And that the teachings of Jesus specifically directly have something beautiful and wise and good to say in terms of how you build your life. And so let's go to the first one in terms of the issue of attachment. So go ahead, and I'd like to hear you explain to our audience a little bit more about what you mean by attachment, bonding, connection, isolation, disruptive connection, and lack of connection.
Well, in fact, in the popular vernacular, if you hang out very long on, Reels or Instagram or wherever, you're gonna see somebody pop up about, "Why are you struggling in your relationship? It could be your attachment style." Well, that it's gotten popular in the last probably, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. But that concept really came from the earliest days of psychology, and basically what it is this, that if you've noticed, if you've ever been around a baby, you can't play chess with them. You can't
I have noticed
you
that
can't
actually. It's
have you noticed
infuriating.
that?
Yeah.
You can't play bridge. You can't play golf. There's not a lot you can do with them except one thing, and that is you can hold them and connect with them. So every human being, and this is so important to performance in
Mm.
teams, in people's lives, in companies, both clinically, relationally, and in your, results, that human beings need connection with other human beings to it's like Wi-Fi to download everything that we need internally to be able to perform in the external world. There's all this stuff about, I'm a self-made man or self-made woman or, only depend on myself or whatever. Well, if we had the video of your life, we would see how psychotic that is. Okay. The only reason that anybody is ever able to self-regulate is because you've had moods that were soothed by the outside, and that soothing system got internalized from a primary caretaker. And so connection really, if you take a baby and if you feed them and water them, and that's all you do, and this really happens, like, in some institutions or, in a lot of places, horrible places in the world where they just have too many babies and they can't do anything but, take care of their physical needs. And then somebody adopts them 10, 12 years later and they have behavior problems.
Huh.
We can hook their brains up to a scan where there's literal hardwiring in the brain that didn't get laid down because of the absence of connectedness and attachment. And babies without a secure attachment, they have their immune systems don't work as well, their IQs are lower, their brain size is smaller, their body weight is lower, they get sick more, and that's all the way to when people are 80, 90, 100 years old, and in between. Why do we have all these books on teams? Because we gotta get connected in order to perform the best. So that's the first one. Now, the opposite of connection is insecure connection or attachment, and that's where we have fears. You see people acting out, fears of abandonment, don't reject me, or control, or all this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And that affects our lives. And so a lot of people's performance is based on a fear of, if I don't perform well, I'm gonna get fired. Well, that's an abandonment fear, right? I mean, we're talking about how they're wired. Now you get into this stuff and we're talking about the way your brain works, the way your amygdala gets hijacked because of fear or somebody's going to leave you or disapprove of you or, whatever. This affects human performance. People that, if somebody walked onto the Final Four, the big game, and right before they walked onto their game, their fiance said, "I'm leaving you," you would see different performance in
Huh.
that game.
Hmm.
This stuff affects us. So that's the first one. That's what connection is.
What would you say is the solution to that? Like, how did if someone was raised, and I guess this is getting a little bit into, you talk in the book about open and closed systems, and what is the solution for a person who didn't get the hardware installed? Are they just doomed forever?
No, no, no,
Yeah, how does that work?
not at all. Well, first thing that they have to realize is that they have a need for it, and if they do, if somebody's pretty healthy, the experience of what I call transformational moments, transformational experiences, which means I am in a certain state. I'm I'm afraid, I'm confused, I'm lonely, and then I connect with somebody who and I talk about that and I process that and they hear me and they're with me and that state of being afraid or I don't have any hope in that connection somehow when I leave the appointment or the meeting or the lunch or whatever, I'm in a different state now. Now I've got some hope, or now I'm not feeling as alone, or now I'm not feeling as discouraged. Okay, that's what connection does with us. But what I said was, if you know that experience, because if you know that experience, then you are familiar with being aware of your own feelings and your own states, and you have the capacity to speak from that vulnerable spot. All right, now I just said a big, big, big deal right there. You're aware of that you're not doing so well inside. And when you are not doing so well inside, you have the ability to grasp that vulnerability and to say to somebody, hey, I need to talk. I'm not doing so well. Okay. Now let's just take both of those. You said, are people doomed? Well, how many CEOs, high performers, and we read about it in the paper all the time, they're not aware of their internal loneliness. What they're aware of is they need to find the next hooker, or they need to find the next drug, or they need to find the next deal. Because what they're doing is they're medicating a deep sense of aloneness with looking for the next, you know, high, the next sense of relief and that adrenaline, push or whatever it is. So a lot of people don't know this is what's behind their, now it's not behind every erratic behavior, but this is what's behind it. So you got to become aware of it, but then it takes another person. I mean, we, we, babies don't feed themselves. You don't, at the halftime when you're 2 touchdowns down, you don't go into a phone booth, do you? You go into the locker room and the coach pumps life back into you in some way. We know this about, Harvard just did a 75-year longitudinal study. The number one success factor in life by far was the quality of your closest relationships.
Hmm.
So it's a big deal. So you're not doomed at all. At all. I mean, I've spent decades being in the room repairing this stuff with people, but you're not doomed. But it's sort of like saying, well, if I'm hungry, am I doomed? Not if you go into a restaurant or a grocery store, but you got to be aware that you're hungry and you got to go in and you got to reach out and pull it off the shelf. And it's got to be there. So you got to go somewhere where, you can find some connection.
We can find some connection. Okay, so then now talk to us about the second one, which is the issue of freedom, separateness, autonomy, boundaries, differentiation, and control. In some ways, these sound like polarities, like things that exist in attention. Number one, number two. Is that right?
Is exactly right. You should have been a shrink. See there? They are polarities, and that's the big problem for a lot of people. What we're talking about, a connection takes two people, right? So now we're going to get connected. Well, if I'm connected to you, what happened to me? Did I lose me in our connection? And a lot of people do. So when they become connected to somebody, they lose their own choices because they don't have boundaries enough to say, when somebody says, hey, let's go do this, I go, well, no, I don't want to do that. See, a relationship is not, it's unity in that we are one, but it takes two to make one. And so we're still two. So the best marriages, the best teams, the best relationships have room for each person's desires and wishes and wills and choices and thoughts and feelings and desires and values and limits and everything we can bring into a relationship, and we can be free from control. So these are all of the controlling issues that you see in relationships, or somebody doesn't allow somebody, quote unquote, to be themselves. They dominate, they control them. And the other side of that is the boundaries issues of somebody can't say, put up a fence and say, no, you're stepping over into my head, or you're stepping over into my heart, or you're putting crap in my yard over here. and set limits and say, I'm not going to allow that to happen in my life. And so that's the freedom thing. I mean, now here's the thing. Some people are so afraid of being in control, they give up connection.
Hmm. Huh.
How many commitment phobic, usually the men get blamed for this, but in the singles world, how many commitment phobic stories have you heard? Somebody gets really close. Oh, I found the one. Well, you found the one until you find out they're really the one. Really the one, then you start to really like them and you're, oh no. and then you bail, like at the altar or something. And I mean, I see these dynamics in boardrooms all the time, in doing deals, a new leader comes in. Well, how much control is he going to take of me, or is she going to take of me? And it's rampant in life.
Hmm. And then, and that's, let's see, I'm going to go in order, but you mentioned like power and authority and things like that. Actually, let's go there next. Let's leave the third one for last because
Hey, can I say one quick thing?
yeah.
Um, because it just went through my head. It's a client of mine that started a multi-billion dollar company, um, and has a partner, and they started together, sort of out of the broom closet, right? And it was very simple. He said, "Oh, we always had a mutual one veto power agreement.
Hmm.
If one of us didn't want to do something, we're not doing it."
Hmm.
And I was thinking about that. That's how relationship ought to work. You know, everybody should have a veto power of what they're going to do or not. And another person, can't join that if they don't want to do it. Well, certainly roles, will, when you get into authority and you can't veto the boss, but that's not the human dynamic. In the best teams, we do have somebody's got decision rights, but that's different than vetoing me as a person. And the best decisions are made because everybody has the freedom to come into that space and give their opinion.
Well, and with that fourth thing, so I want to read it again and then I want to frame it. The leveling of power that evolves from childhood to adulthood. And again, this is Henry and I aren't necessarily talking about soft skills. These affect whether you're on the ice or the court or the boardroom, or if you're like in our firm, we have lots of coaches working with clients. These issues are coming up whether you realize it or not. And you make a distinction in the book of equality and authority, that you can be under authority of somebody and equal with them at the same time. And I thought that was really
Right.
interesting, and I'd like for you to share a little more about that.
Well, this is a big deal. Um, in fact, I just had this happen yesterday. I was on a consulting call, and somebody actually was the CEO, was talking about really difficult struggle that he's having in his executive team because one of the VPs has been there longer and has more, street cred in the company than the one that's only been there, like a year. And because of that and a few other issues, the one that's only been there a year is not really speaking up to, the star, right?
Hmm.
And they're missing out on some key information
Hmm.
and some key opinions because the one that came really, really, really does know what she's doing. I mean, she's over IT and she came from a very famous large company we would all know. But the psychological dynamic in the room, she feels one down to this other person. See, that's a psychological dynamic that some people feel because in their developmental years, they never became an adult psychologically. So that I can be in a big person's body and I'm around the table with other big people, which means you're over 18, but I feel one down. Now we're talking about feelings here. We're talking about experiences here. We're talking about self-doubt. We're talking about criticism. We're talking about all this stuff in our heads. Now, it may be somebody at that table is the boss and they have the decision rights. But what a good boss is going to tell you is, I can't use my authority to make a decision without all of my experts speaking into it
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
having the psychological experience to tell me when I'm wrong. Now,
Hmm.
if you exercise your authority as a dictator and people can't do that, then you're an idiot anyway. But we're talking about in good in good teams. You know, a president's not going to go to war without talking to the Joint Chiefs. Now, they don't have the decision rights that a president have, but they have expertise that he doesn't have. Because different equal adults have different roles and expertise and talents that we all need.
And you mentioned another thing you mentioned in that section, which I thought was really interesting. I think our listeners will appreciate is the idea of you're only an employee because you choose to be, meaning like you're choosing to work, quote, for someone.
Right.
And people oftentimes uh, relinquish their own power unnecessarily. I'm not saying this quite right, but can talk a little bit about the distinction of reminding people that they have agency and they have a boss because they chose to work for that person, and there's some kind of mutually beneficial arrangement that's happening, or something like that.
Well, it sounds weird, but to obey a boss's decision that you disagree with is a self-enhancing move.
Hmm.
Because what you're doing is that you you you're out there as an adult, right? You're floating along there. And as an adult with 1,000 different choices, and we're assuming some things here. I realize sometimes in particular moments, you know, or times, hopefully only seasons, if somebody's really, really in need, that may be the only, you know, job they get. But they're still doing that for a need of their own, right? And so, but by and large, you've chosen to work there. Okay. So when you choose to work somewhere, you're taking your adulthood, your talents, and your abilities to this company, and you're making an exchange, an adult contract that they will pay you for what you bring to the party that they need, that they value. All right. So we got a contract. Now we have different roles in that. From your side, you're going to do A, B, and C. From their side, they're going to do A, B, and C and provide resources and desks and computers or whatever they're going to do. And they have some decision rights. Now you have some decision rights that they're granting you too. And so everybody has a role. Well, one of their decision rights is you can bring a project to them and they can say no. All right. When you when y'all go through that process and ultimately they say no, and you go, okay, you're the boss. Well, you're the one that made that decision to make them the boss. So that's really self-validating. I mean, here's the problem. If somebody's coming into that conversation as a child in psychologically, you got an adult role that says, you know, we're giving up decision rights here to different people. But if you feel like a kid, then every time a boss says something, you go, who does he think he is? Tell me what, I
Hmm.
can't believe he, and people have these authority conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's because they've lost their power internally to them. They gave it away because they're still fighting a battle with somebody that is not in the room.
Yeah. And I imagine that's a polarity too,
And
because
it's the same thing with a person that doesn't fight the battle, but stays quiet and doesn't give their opinion. And the same thing with a bad boss that sees the world as one up and one down and dominates people and bites their head off to their own demise.
yeah, and that's what I was gonna say is there's that polarity of, kind of worshiping authority or rebelling against authority, and both of those, have pros and cons, I suppose, but they're gonna not over a long time horizon, those are not good strategies.
Well, when Ed Catmull did the pulling together of the cultures,
Yeah,
you know,
Disney and Pixar. Yeah.
Disney and Pixar, what he said was, when he came, he said he realized the culture was the problem. It wasn't the brains, it wasn't the lack of talent. He had to change the culture. And he said it took about 5 years. And he said one of the biggest things that was inhibiting innovation was the dynamic we're talking about right now. And so he did a lot of different things, but one of the things he did was that what he when a movie was finished, before it went to market, when it's finished, everybody's been working on this thing for like 2 years. They bring it in to watch it, right? Everybody that worked on it. And they started with a mantra. And the mantra was, "This movie sucks." This is before they've watched it. "This movie sucks. Our job is to make it not suck." That's how they started before they hit the on switch. And then the second thing he said was, "Ideas have no rank." So if you see a better line in the movie than the one that was written, or a better way to go into that scene that you think, we got to have that thought out there, and they have no rank. I don't care if the CEO wrote the line. If you're a receptionist and you got a better line, we need it. Okay. And then he said in the rooms where they watched it, he took away any kind of architecture that would make it somebody's at the head of the table, and it was like beanbags or something. What he was doing was he was fighting the dynamics that are toxic, that limit performance in people's heads. It was brilliant. And in fact, I walked up to him after his talk, and we were both speaking at the summit that year, and I said, "You're a neuroscientist. You just don't know it.
Hmm.
This
I bet he
is
loved that.
neuroscience."
Yeah, he told me a story one time. He said, when he brought the Disney executives before they did the merger, they brought Disney executives to come and watch part of the Brain Trust meeting at Pixar, and the Disney folks walked out afterwards, and they go, "That was," pardon my French, we may bleep this out, was like, "That was a shit show." And Ed was flabbergasted by that. He's like, "Why?" And he's like, "Because there was like there's like dispute and argument and disagreement and all this kind of stuff." And he's like, "Yeah, but it wasn't like ad hominem. It wasn't personal. It was trying to make the thing better." And in that moment, I was like, "Oh wow!" Like when you are living in an unhealthy environment, health looks dysfunctional to you. And Disney had developed an unhealthy environment, and when they actually experienced health, which was they were arguing respectfully, passionately, uh, and it looked quote toxic to them, but in reality, that's healthy, and the fruit of it, the evidence of the health is those guys love and gals love working with each other, and they consistently produce great art.
Well, and you just illustrated something. If you just had a script of what was said in that meeting, you couldn't see the people, right? And you're gonna see lines like, "Are you kidding me? That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen." And you really go, "Oh my gosh, this is a shit show. These people are like criticizing each other, this and the other." But if you were in it, like you said, because why? The first issue we talked about was connection.
Mm, mm,
They're very connected. They know they're loved by that person. They know they're respected. Second issue we talked about was separateness. That we value the separate ideas that people are free to have, and we actually desire them in our connection. And then the last one, we didn't talk about the third issue, but the fourth one you said was this one up and one down thing, where when you tell me that's stupid, you're not judging me. You're
mm,
giving me a different opinion because we're equals. And
mm,
an equal can't judge me.
mm.
All an equal can do is disagree with me.
Yeah.
And if I don't put people up above me, I'm not being judged. I remember I was doing an event one time, and a lady said, um, "Well, how do you deal with controlling people?" And I said, "Oh, it's easy. I convert them." And she goes, "Well, they're not interested in God." And I said, "I didn't say anything about God." She said, "You said you convert them." I said, "No, I convert them from being a controlling person to a frustrated person." She goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, everybody you're describing as controlling in your life, they're only controlling because you're doing what they're pushing you to do. That's why you're calling them controlling. All you gotta do is say no. They don't have control of anything. You'll find out how powerless they are when you say no, but they're gonna look really frustrated. So I convert them from being controlling to frustrated by the word no. And see, if we're equals, then I'm not judged by you. I disagree with your evaluation of me.
Yeah, that's really
Period.
good, Henry. Let's touch on the last one, and then we'll round third and wrap a bow on this. The third one, or the fourth one rather, which is a third in your book, but for this conversation, it makes sense to put a fourth, is people's inability to deal with the reality that life has good and bad things in it, the imperfections of life. Am I saying that right?
Let me clear up this confusion. Look, human beings are built like a house. Okay. There's a there's a blueprint. We all end up looking the same. When you build a house, there's a blueprint, and the first thing that is the foundation is laid in the ground. Your foundation in life is your connections. How connected you are. That's how stable you're going to be. You know, when a Unabomber or somebody floats up and causes destruction, where they always find they're emotionally, at least, isolated or
And sometimes
disconnected
literally, like the
usually.
Unabomber was in literally a cabin in the
Yeah.
woods.
Yeah. Or all the other horrible instances, they're not close to anyone. Okay, that's our foundation. Then you build a frame on the house. The frame of your house is your boundaries, the structure that shows this is your house separate than the one next door. We can't tell neighbors until you frame the house, right? Okay, so you got a frame. The third one is that they wire the house with a regulatory system so that you can live in the house. So it doesn't get too hot, it doesn't get too cold. So the crap in the house gets flushed out into the sewage system instead of living there. So fresh water can come into the house. In other words, the regulatory system of a human, what gets laid down next is my emotional regulation. How do I process failure? What do I do with pain? What do I do with the trash? How do I get, good stuff in? How
Hmm.
do I all of that stuff. So we were we were designed to live, I love the story of the Garden of Eden because it explains this perfectly. We weren't designed to deal with all this crap. I mean, we ought to realize that, right? Because it hurts
Yeah.
every day and we don't do a good job of solving pain. We were supposed to live in the ideal perfect world. Even Plato, everybody else, we can all conceive of what perfection is. When you fall in love, you can conceive, or you're looking for love, you can conceive, or you're looking for a job, you can conceive of what the perfect boss would be like. Well, then we find ourselves in this imperfect universe where even though they got a lot of good traits, they got some bad ones too.
Hmm.
Sometimes they disappoint me. Even though I've got some strengths, I got some weaknesses. Sometimes I fail. The great performers are not people that never lose. The great performers are people that lose well. The happiest people are people that never hurt. The happiest people are people that hurt well. And if we can't deal with the coexistence of having ideals and perfectionistic good goals and we want to kill it, if we can't deal with the reality that sometimes we don't kill it, and how do I process that, learn from it, get over it, flush it out, and move on, then I'm not going to be able to perform well. Too much
Huh.
performance anxiety. And then once that's wired, then we get to the fourth issue of, what's going to happen in the house? What are my talents and my abilities? And what am I going to contribute to the neighborhood and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I mean by the four.
Yeah. And those four elements are grounded in research. 100 years of modern psychology would have no
More than
problem.
that, actually. And as you mentioned, way more than that in philosophy. And what I said is, y- you know, evidence-based science was because there's one area of science. I write about a lot of the sciences in the book. If my faith was validated by science, but one area of science I can claim expertise in is in psychology. And the science of psychology to me proved the Bible to be true because those are those 4 themes are hammered out in great detail about the importance to thriving.
Well, and you mentioned one of the things you appreciated about as you wrestled with mm, the Bible was it explained reality better than other sources. Like when you read it, it's like, oh yeah, that's my life where there's greed and there's jealousy and there's bitterness and there's the need for forgiveness and there's all these things. Like I felt like I feel like you said that it said, you didn't say these words, but it gave you the most reliable compass for navigating those types of things.
Oh, I was astounded. Um, and the weird thing is that I had to kinda go through this, there's a difference between what we understand. I mean, you've experienced this, even with people. You hear about somebody, right? And they're this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. But then you actually meet them and you're around them enough to really know, not in a casual meeting, and they're really nothing like that other person described. That other person had some kind of issue or they had heard it from somebody else. And that's what I found out about the faith, that all the things that I thought it include, like judgmentalism and exclusiveness and, you know, all of this stuff, what not only was it not in there in what Jesus said, those were the same things he got mad at. And I would say to a lot of people, say, "Well, I don't like it because it's this and this and this and this." I go, "Oh, so you're kind of a Christian and don't know it because that's he agrees with you." And so what I had to do was find out, what's really in there. And then I went, "Oh my gosh, this is yes, I get this."
Richard Dawkins has used a phrase recently. If you don't know who Richard Dawkins, of course Henry does, but if you're listening to this and you don't know who Richard Dawkins is he's a very famous scientist, geneticist, I believe. He wrote a book called The Selfish Gene. Mimetic theory is kind of his baby that he offered to the world that has since permeated culture. And recently, he's been using the phrase. He's an devout atheist, and he's been using the phrase. He feels like he's a cultural Christian, and which I find to be really fascinating, but also very honest of him, especially for a guy who doesn't really like Christianity much. Is for him to say I'm a cultural Christian, and what that means is he's coming to realize, especially as he navigates what's happening in his neck of the woods in Europe these days. He's realizing that there are these kind of foundational ideas that Western civilization has taken for granted, that in many ways are being threatened and are crumbling. Um, that he's like, oh, these are actually really important ideas. And then he's discovering that, oh, wow, these ideas have been held up over the last couple of thousand years of Western history by whether it's the Irish monks who kind of brought in the Renaissance in the out and out of the Dark Ages, or whether it was
And
um,
don't forget, it was the monks that gave us great wine and champagne.
that's
So
correct. So there you go, two more pillars of the Western civilization. And so there's this idea that the teachings of Jesus have had a profound impact on Western civilization, so much so that people don't even realize how much they resonate with his teachings, which I think to your point earlier, and as in this Christmas season, if you're listening to this around when the podcast drops, uh, an invitation is to go and read those 4 historical biographies in the Bible about Jesus. This Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is what people call them, and you can read those for yourself and just see if there's any wisdom there, see if there's any um, value there for you. There's Derek Sivers wrote a book. There's an author I really like named Derek Sivers, and he wrote a book called "Useful, Not True." And essentially, what he was saying is, he goes and he finds ideas, and he doesn't care as much whether they're true or not. He just finds them that they're useful. And I think what you and I might say is these ideas in the scriptures are useful and true.
when you say like useful but not true, uh, y- yeah, but what I came to in my life was that it's sort of like this whole thing today, about there eh, eh, big discussion, in education and math. Well, 2 plus 2 really doesn't equal 4. It's
Uh-huh.
how they're teaching. Well, maybe not, but I want the pilot of my plane to believe that there are some absolute laws that govern the universe, to know that up is up and down really is down. And so, I just realized that this thing has a design to it. And where there's a design, there's a designer. And so the book talks about, I go through many areas of science in the book, and really, really, really smart people, like unraveling the DNA code. Well, there's a good one. Well, it was unraveling the DNA code that led him to become a believer.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's
Yeah.
it's a big topic.
Well, in my own journey, and I experience this with a lot of my friends and colleagues who've come to faith in different areas of their life, is they say, Jason, I found that it was useful, but I didn't believe it was true. Then I found that it was so useful that I was open to it being true. And then it became so useful that I just decided it was true. And and, so again, in this holiday season, you can check out Henry's book, Why I Believe, and it is a lovely, again, the first part's a spiritual memoir. The second part has crazy ass stories of, of
You
miracles
you
and
can't
stuff.
even talk about the second part without going goofy on me.
Yeah, and then the third part really is where he lays out some core ideas of human flourishing and health that have been around for thousands of years and codified in the scriptures, and specifically the teachings of Jesus, and along with some other things that we didn't get to today. And I will say, faith has enhanced my life, and it's obviously enhanced and been a huge part of Henry's life. And if you're starting 2025 and you're looking for connection, if you're looking for something to help you with your boundaries, if you're looking for something to help you with your relationship to authority and power, and something to help you with the way that you deal with evil in the world and the imperfections of the world, including the imperfections in yourself, give faith a try. And we both found that it can help you go beyond high performance. And so, Henry, thank you for being on our show.
Okay, do we have time for one quick question?
Yeah, man, do it.
You hiccup so hard about this second section of the book, the miracle section. Tell me the one that you think is the most, like, hard for you to believe.
Well, none of them are hard for me to believe. I'm more putting myself in the position of a person reading it who just thinks it's all malarkey. So
Oh, I see,
yeah,
okay.
so I love that chapter, and I really enjoyed those stories, and they're inspiring. So as we're talking, Henry, I really am thinking of the listener who they come to this podcast for great leadership stuff, and then why are you talking about God? Why are you talking about a Jewish rabbi who's executed by the Roman state 2,000 years ago? Like, why are we having this conversation? And so
It's
I'm thinking.
Christmas.
That's right. Yeah. So that's a little bit of where that's coming from, is empathy for the audience, and so
And
when they
besides, if you would grow your hair out long, you kinda have the look there.
Yeah, well, except for the Aryan part. I think that's I definitely have
Oh, well, there's that.
yeah, there's that. But if people listen to this and then go buy your book, I want them to be excited and well primed for what they're going to experience, and to say, when I read that chapter, I often think, I often wonder why I have experienced hard to explain things in my life, hard to explain beautiful things that I would associate with God intervening in my life in meaningful ways. And I'd like to have more of that in my life. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, man, I don't know if God's real or not, but if God is real, I would like to have a I would like to have more love in my life. I would like to have better relationships in my life. I would like to have miracles in my life. Maybe you're sick and you'd like to have experience physical healing. Maybe you have a broken relationship and you want to have that healed. Maybe there's a hope or a dream of a career that you have, and it's weird to think that God would even care about that, but maybe God does care, and maybe God would love to open doors for you, like He has for Henry, and the story he alluded to earlier in the podcast that we didn't talk about, that you can buy the book and hear for yourself how God intervened in Henry's life and changed his career trajectory radically, multiple times for the better. And so I read that chapter, Henry, and I think, man, I want more. I would like, if God is real, I would like more of that in my life. And so, and by the way, I'll say this too, because prayer is a part of my life, and even and by the way, our firm, our executive coaching firm, has people of all different faiths, and so it's a fun, eclectic group. And we have a prayer Slack, so we pray for each other. And Henry, if you're a praying man, and I know that you are, I would love for you to pray for me. Like there are things going on in my life that I would really love. You don't have to pray for me now, but like I would love God's intervention in some areas of my life where it kind of feels like I'm asking for miracles. It kind of feels like whether it's in career or my private life or whatever. And I think that's part of the adventure of faith is if you don't believe in God, you're not allowed to believe in miracles. Um, so I find believing in God to be more liberal in terms of I have the freedom to believe in miracles because I believe in God, and I find that belief to be life-giving, and I find the hope and possibility of miracles and believing that there's a world that exists where miracles can happen. That makes life more romantic for me, and it makes life more expansive. And it's kind of like you mentioned champagne. It lets the champagne breathe for me a little bit, and it makes going out into the world a little more of an adventure. And
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
and it also, I mean, because a lot of things you describe, some people say, well, God opens doors or this and the other. You take that's kind of natural stuff happening, which I, I believe God has a hand in a lot of those. But what we're also talking about is supernatural things happening. You said like physical healing, for example. And my point being, when you said, it opens up the world to having a world with champagne in it. Well, it also opens up the world when you run out of wine, he can make more. So, but the areas of life where things don't exist that we need, the supernatural part is, and as I talk about in the book, um, whenever we get to the end of the road, there's no more road. That what I found and millions of other people have found is that he can build a road where one does not exist. And when you see those things begin to happen, and I'm talking about literal things that cannot be explained naturally. I've got several of those in the book. They're easy to find. If sometimes I hear people say, "Why don't miracles still happen?" I go, what rock do you live under? I mean, go to YouTube. You don't. Anyway,
Yeah.
so
Well,
we always have hope.
and I know, Henry, I've heard you in other interviews, and we even talked about it before the book came out. Like you wrote this book because you live in a professional world where your faith has been so helpful for you in so many ways. And how does a writer talk about something that's been so helpful for them? Well, they write a book about it. And so thank you for writing Why I Believe. I enjoyed reading it. I think if you're listening to this, you will too. And here's to more roads when it feels like there's no roads. Here's to champagne. Here's to adventure, and here's to a faith that makes that possible for us. So thank you, Henry, and Merry Christmas.
Same to you. It's good to be with you.
It's always good to see you. All right, we have a few more things to let you know about before we go. First, podcast reviews really help us serve more people. So if this podcast is helpful for you, we'd love your help to get it into as many leaders' hands as possible. Please leave us a review, even if it's not 5 stars. And if you really want to go the extra mile, let us know what you'd like to hear more of, or what you think we could do better to serve you and the people you care about. Okay, second, we have more resources for you online, and they're all free. We have free assessments, educational videos, articles from sources like Fast Company, written by our coaches and clients, all designed to help you use our tools in your everyday life and leadership. To dive into the free treasure trove of goodies we have for you, go to novus.global and then click on resources. Some of you have been listening for a while, and you haven't yet taken that next step to hire a coach. This is your time. I can't tell you how often I've heard from clients around the world that they wish they would have talked to us sooner. If you have a sense that you're capable of more, we would be thrilled to explore what coaching could do for you and those you influence. Simply email us at begin@novus.global or click the link in the show notes. You also might be listening to this thinking, maybe you want to be a coach, or maybe you already are and you have a vision to build a 6 or 7-figure practice coaching people you love in a way that brings life to you and your clients. Well, that's why we created the METAPERFORMANCE Institute for Coaching. It is an in-depth coaching apprenticeship designed to help you create the coaching practice of your dreams. The first step in exploring that is simple. Just go to www.mp, as in metaperformance.institute. There we have free assessments to help you see what kind of training you need to create the coaching practice the way our coaches do at Novus Global. Finally, this show is produced by Rainbow Creative with Matthew Jones as executive producer, Stephen Selnick as producer, and Rob Johnson as audio editor and engineer. We love working with this team. Find out more about how to create a podcast for you and your business at rainbowcreative.co. Thank you so much for listening. We love making these for you. And remember, dare to go beyond high performance.